The porcelain shatters on the deck of British warship Nemesis. The teacup, hand-painted with blue willow patterns, cost more than the sailor scrubbing the planks earned in a year. Yet here they are, off the coast of Canton in 1841, firing explosive rockets at Chinese forts to keep cups like this one filled. The First Opium War was not fought over territory or religion. It was fought to protect a supply chain. Britain had become dependent on a leaf from China, and when that supply was threatened, the Royal Navy was deployed. This was not an accident of policy. It was the logical endpoint of a transformation that began a century earlier, when luxury stopped being about taste and became the architecture of state power. Welcome to Luxury Historian, where luxury, status symbols, and power set the rules, but every shine hides a cost. Tea arrived in Britain in the 1660s as a curiosity. Chinese leaf, expensive, medicinal, consumed only by the elite in tiny doses. It was foreign, bitter, strange, a novelty for those who could afford novelties. By 1700, something shifted. Tea drinking became a ritual, not just consumption, but performance. The correct porcelain set, the silver spoons, the precise temperature of the water, the angle of the pour. These were not preferences. They were social codes that separated those who belonged from those who did not. The ritual required props. Chinese porcelain became essential. British potters could not replicate the translucence, the thinness, the ring of the cup when tapped. Every tea service was an import. Every saucer, a reminder of dependence. Then sugar entered the equation. Tea alone was too bitter for most palates. Sweetened tea became palatable, then habitual, then universal. The combination was not an accident. It was a chemical lock that turned a luxury into a craving. The numbers tell the story. In 1700, Britain imported 100,000 pounds of tea. By 1800, that figure was 20 million pounds. This was no longer elite consumption. This was a national habit that crossed class boundaries. Workers in Manchester drank tea. Farmers in Yorkshire drank tea. The poorest households allocated a portion of their income to tea and sugar. The state noticed. By 1784, tea taxes accounted for 10% of government revenue. The Treasury now relied on this consumption. It was not optional. It was fiscal infrastructure. The cognitive shift was complete. What began as a choice became a right, then a necessity, then something the government was obligated to protect. The luxury had transformed into a dependency, and dependency must be secured. The question was no longer whether Britain needed tea. The question was how far the state would go to ensure the supply never stopped. Consider the mechanics. A working family in London in 1780 consumed tea daily. They bought it from a shopkeeper, who bought it from a merchant, who bought it from the East India Company, who bought it from Chinese traders in Canton. That chain stretched 12,000 miles and crossed 3 oceans. Every link in that chain was a point of failure. A storm could sink a ship. A war could close a port. A policy change in Beijing could halt the trade entirely. The longer the chain, the more vulnerable it became. But the dependency was irreversible. You cannot un-addict a population. You cannot untax a revenue stream. You cannot dismantle a ritual that defines social belonging. So the state did what states do when dependencies are threatened. It mobilized force to protect them. The luxury supply chain became a strategic asset, and strategic assets are defended with soldiers and ships. Sound familiar? In 2025, we call it coffee, 12,000-mile supply chains, climate-dependent crops, geopolitical vulnerabilities. Same pattern, different leaf. The average American drinks 3 cups a day. If that supply stopped tomorrow, what would your government do? The teacup on the deck of Nemesis was not an accident. It was the reason the ship was built. The East India Company was not a government. It was a corporation. But by 1800, it governed 90 million people in India, commanded 260,000 soldiers, and operated the largest supply chain on Earth. It held a monopoly granted by the Crown. No other British entity could trade with Asia. No competition. Total control of tea, silk, porcelain, and spices flowing into Britain. The company was not just a merchant, it was the gatekeeper of luxury itself. The scale was unprecedented. The company owned territories larger than most European nations. It collected taxes, it minted currency, it waged wars, it signed treaties, all under the banner of commerce. This was empire as a business model. Profit and governance were not separate, they were the same mechanism. The company extracted wealth from India to fund its operations in China. It used military force to secure trade routes. It deployed violence as a cost of doing business. The problem was structural. Britain wanted Chinese tea, millions of pounds of it every year. But China had no interest in British goods. The Qing emperors did not want wool, they did not want iron, they did not want manufactured textiles. China was self-sufficient. The only currency China accepted was silver, pure, minted silver. So Britain had to pay in silver for every chest of tea, every bolt of silk, every porcelain plate. The silver flowed out of Britain at unsustainable rates. This was a crisis for the company. Its profits depended on trade with China, but the trade was draining Britain's silver reserves. The balance was impossible to maintain. Something had to reverse the flow. The solution was opium. The company grew it in Bengal, massive plantations producing raw opium paste. The company then smuggled it into China through private merchants, technically maintaining deniability while controlling the entire operation. Chinese demand for opium exploded. Addiction spread through coastal cities and inland provinces. Silver that had been flowing out of Britain now flowed back in. Chinese silver, paid for opium, used to buy tea. The circuit was complete. This was not trade. This was a narcotic triangle operating under state charter. The luxury good, tea, now depended on a military-backed drug cartel. The company used its army to protect opium shipments. It used its navy to enforce smuggling routes. It used its political influence in London to ensure the government would not interfere. The British public knew. Missionaries reported the devastation in China. Newspapers published accounts of opium dens and ruined families. Parliament debated the morality of the trade, but the dependency was too deep. The revenue was too essential. The tea could not stop. By the 1830s, the system was generating enormous profits. The company paid dividends to shareholders in London. The British Treasury collected taxes on tea imports. The entire structure rested on opium flowing into China and tea flowing out. Then the Qing government tried to stop it. In 1839, the Chinese emperor appointed Lin Zexu as imperial commissioner to end the opium trade. Lin confiscated and destroyed over 1,000 tons of opium in Canton. He blockaded foreign merchants. He demanded the trade cease immediately. The company's model was threatened. If opium stopped, the silver stopped. If the silver stopped, the tea stopped. If the tea stopped, Britain's fiscal infrastructure collapsed. The dependency had become total. The British government had a choice. Accept the loss and find another way to pay for tea, or deploy the Royal Navy to protect the company's operations. They chose force. The teacup required it. Today we call it the petrodollar. Middle East oil keeps dollars valuable. Dollars buy oil. Anyone who tries to break the circuit gets a visit from the Navy. Iraq tried in 2000. Libya tried in 2011. The teacup is now a barrel. The wars never stopped. Tea required sugar, not as an option, but as a necessity. Unsweetened tea remained too bitter for mass consumption. The ritual that defined British social life depended on sugar being cheap and abundant. Sugar came from the Caribbean. British-controlled islands, Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, operated as extraction sites. land, labor, and life converted into crystallized profit. The plantations were not farms. They were factories running on human fuel. By 1770, sugar was Britain's most valuable import. More than tea, more than anything else entering British ports. The volume was staggering. Millions of pounds annually, processed in refineries, distributed through networks of merchants, consumed in every household that could afford it. The economics were simple. Caribbean soil and climate produced sugar efficiently, but sugar cultivation required intensive labor. Planting, harvesting, processing, all done by hand in brutal heat, under conditions designed to maximize output and minimize cost. Enslaved Africans provided that labor. The transatlantic slave trade was not a separate system from luxury consumption. It was the foundation. British ships carried enslaved people to the Caribbean. Those people produced sugar. That sugar sweetened British tea. The teacup and the plantation were parts of the same machine. The scale made it invisible. A London family drinking sweetened tea did not see the Caribbean. They did not see the labor. They did not see the violence required to keep sugar prices low enough for daily consumption. The distance erased the connection, but the connection was absolute. Tea and sugar were not separate luxuries. They were a single system. One required the other. Both required the Caribbean plantations. Both required the slave trade. Both required the Royal Navy to protect the islands as strategic assets. When slave revolts threatened the supply, Britain responded with force. The Haitian Revolution in 1791 terrified British planters. An entire colony of enslaved people overthrowing their masters, burning plantations, establishing an independent nation. The threat was not just moral, it was economic. If Haiti succeeded, other islands might follow. If other islands followed, sugar production would collapse. If sugar production collapsed, tea consumption would decline. If tea consumption declined, tax revenue would fall. The dependency chain ran in both directions. Britain deployed troops to suppress revolts in Jamaica. The Royal Navy blockaded Haiti to prevent the revolution from spreading. The violence was not incidental, it was policy. The sugar had to flow. The logic was identical to the opium trade. A luxury good becomes a fiscal necessity. The state becomes dependent on its supply. Any threat to that supply justifies military intervention. The difference was only in the product and the location. Caribbean sugar and Chinese tea were the twin pillars of British luxury consumption. Both required violence to maintain. Both were defended as national interests. Both were so deeply embedded in daily life that questioning them seemed absurd. The working poor in Britain consumed sweetened tea as a caloric subsidy. It was cheaper than beer, safer than water, and provided energy for industrial labor. Factory owners encouraged it. The government taxed it. The system depended on it. The teacup in London was filled by the lash in Barbados. The connection was not hidden. It was simply not discussed. In 1839, the Qing Emperor's appointed commissioner arrived in Canton with orders to end the opium trade. Lin Zexu was not a diplomat. He was an enforcer. He confiscated over 20,000 chests of opium from British merchants. He destroyed them publicly. He demanded written pledges that no more opium would enter China. The British merchants refused. Lin blockaded the foreign factories. He cut off food supplies. He arrested Chinese merchants who cooperated with the foreigners. He made it clear, the trade would stop, or the foreigners would leave. The East India Company faced collapse. The opium circuit was not a side business. It was the mechanism that made tea profitable. Without opium sales, there was no silver to buy tea. Without tea, there was no revenue to sustain the company's operations. The entire structure depended on opium flowing into China. The company appealed to London. The British government faced a choice: accept the loss and restructure the entire Asian trade system, or use military force to protect what was, functionally, a state-sanctioned drug cartel. The decision was not difficult. Tea taxes funded the government. The company's dividends enriched shareholders who sat in parliament. The supply chain was too valuable to abandon. The dependency was total. But the government could not say it was going to war to protect opium smuggling. The framing had to be different. The language shifted. This was about free trade, about British honor, about the principle that sovereign nations could not seize British property without consequences. The First Opium War began in 1839. The Royal Navy deployed gunboats with superior firepower. Chinese war junks were no match for steam-powered vessels with rotating cannons. British forces bombarded coastal forts. They blockaded rivers. They occupied strategic ports. The war was not close. British technology and naval superiority made it a systematic dismantling of Chinese coastal defenses. By 1842, British ships were positioned to bombard Nanking. The Qing government had no choice but to negotiate. The Treaty of Nanking imposed terms that guaranteed British access. China ceded Hong Kong to Britain in perpetuity. 5 ports were opened to British trade. China paid 21 million silver dollars in reparations. And critically, the treaty said nothing about opium. The trade would continue, now under the protection of British military presence. The Second War came 14 years later. In 1856, Chinese authorities boarded a British-registered ship and arrested the crew. Britain used this as justification for another military campaign. France joined this time, bringing additional forces and its own grievances. The Second Opium War was more brutal. British and French forces marched inland. They reached Beijing. They burned the Summer Palace, a complex of gardens and pavilions that had taken generations to build. The destruction was deliberate, a message written in ash. The Treaty of Tientsin in 1858 and the Convention of Peking in 1860 expanded British access even further. More ports opened. Foreign diplomats allowed in Beijing. Christian missionaries granted freedom to operate. And opium was legalized. The Chinese government could no longer ban it. Back in Britain, the public largely supported the wars. Newspapers framed them as necessary actions to protect British commerce and dignity. The tea kept flowing. Prices remained stable. The morning ritual continued uninterrupted. Few questioned the mechanism. Tea was too normal, too embedded, too necessary. The idea that Britain was fighting wars to maintain a drug trade that funded a luxury habit seemed absurd when stated plainly. So it was not stated plainly. Luxury was no longer about taste or status. It was about maintaining the empire's metabolic rate. The system required constant feeding. When the supply was threatened, force was deployed. The teacup demanded it. Taiwan makes 90% of advanced semiconductors. Your phone, your car, your military, all dependent on one island. China wants Taiwan. America needs Taiwan. This is the tea trade in silicon. And history says, when supply chains become dependencies, force follows. The East India Company was collapsing under its own weight by 1773. Warehouses in London overflowed with unsold tea. The company owed the British government money. Its stock price was falling. Bankruptcy seemed inevitable. Parliament passed the Tea Act to save it. The act granted the company a monopoly on tea sales in the American colonies. It eliminated middlemen. It undercut smugglers. And it preserved the tax that colonists had been resisting for years. The logic seemed sound in London. Colonists would get cheaper tea. The company would survive. The tax revenue would continue. Everyone benefited. The colonists saw it differently. This was not about the tax rate. It was about being forced into a supply chain they had not chosen. The Tea Act made the American colonies captive consumers of a luxury system built on monopoly power and imperial control. On December 16, 1773, colonists in Boston boarded 3 ships in the harbor. They broke open 342 chests of East India Company tea. They dumped the contents into the water. 45 tons of tea dissolved into the Atlantic. This was not vandalism. It was surgery. They were cutting the imperial umbilical cord. The tea represented everything the colonists rejected: monopoly control, taxation without representation, dependency on a system designed in London for London's benefit. The British government responded with force. The port of Boston was closed. Massachusetts lost its charter. British troops occupied the city. The message was clear: the supply chain would be protected and resistance would be crushed. But the logic worked both ways. If Britain could justify wars to protect tea supply, colonists could justify rebellion to escape tea taxes. The same dependency that made tea worth fighting for in China made it worth fighting against in Boston. The pattern repeated wherever Britain tried to control luxury goods. In India, the company's monopoly on salt sparked resistance. In Ireland, trade restrictions on wool and linen fueled resentment. In the Caribbean, slave revolts directly threatened sugar production. Each time, the empire's response was the same: deploy force, protect the supply chain, maintain the dependency. The luxury system required constant enforcement. The irony was structural. The more necessary these goods became, the more vulnerable the system grew. Total dependency meant total exposure. Every supply chain was a potential breaking point. Every colony was a potential rebellion. The empire's strength was also its weakness. It had built a machine that required constant feeding, and anything that threatened the feed triggered military response. But military responses created new threats. The cycle was self-perpetuating. The teacup did not just fuel the empire, it made the empire brittle. The logic never changed. Luxury still operates as infrastructure. Rare earths, lithium, cobalt, semiconductors, supply chains still protected by sanctions, debt, and force. The tools shifted from gunboats to trade agreements, but the mechanism remains identical. 1841. Nemesis fires on Canton. Mission: protect tea supply. 2025. U.S. Navy patrols Taiwan Strait. Mission: protect semiconductor supply. Different product. Same mathematics, same inevitability. Your phone, your car, your coffee, all depend on supply chains someone is willing to fight for. Luxury never stopped being worth dying for. We just stopped calling it luxury. Britain went to war to protect its tea supply. The addiction demanded it. But there is another side to this pattern. What happens when luxury does not arrive through war, but falls from the sky? When an empire drowns in free gold instead of fighting for scarce leaves? Spain controlled half the world's silver and became the poorest power in Europe. See how unlimited treasure can be more lethal than empty vaults in the next video.